How can we make the world better? By making ourselves better. The Dr. Joe Show explores how you can make positive personal change by using his groundbreaking and highly effective I Am approach to understand who we are and why we do what we do. Your small changes can have big effects.
Join us now for the Dr. Joe Show with Mark Stiles of Stiles Law and your host, Dr. Joe Schrand.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Dr. Joe Show. It's good to have you back, Mark. Oh, it's good to be back. It's good to be back.
Yeah, how was your time? And thank you, Ben. You know, Mark and I was saying we don't thank Ben enough.
No.
So thank you, Ben.
Greg's
Thank you,
very
guys.
good
I
at
appreciate
thanking.
that.
We have a guest coming in for the second half of the show who is, I think, probably one of the world's leading authorities in market forces and the crashes that happen and why. It's called Broken Bargain. I am so excited.
Me too.
That she's coming
Kathleen
here.
Day.
Kathleen Day. You guys can look her up. She's been with the Washington Post for years. We'll read a little bit about her and give you her bio. But people, it's going to really be, I think, an eye-opening show because we are looking at the I am of banking and the I am of market force and the I am of what it means when things don't go right.
Right.
You know, as it says there, the broken bargain.
And
Bargain.
it did not go right back then.
Yeah, and you were right in the thick of it, weren't you?
Yep.
We're talking about
On the ground.
the real estate crash of what was it, the early 2000s?
No.
It was a different one. That's how old I am.
It was, people refer to it as 2008.
2008.
It really started in 2007, and I think the stock market bottomed out March 9th, 2009.
Yep.
And then from there, it's made its way back. But people refer to it as the mortgage meltdown of 2008, the global crisis, the recession of 2008. But it really started in late 2007, and 2008 is when people were walking around staring at their shoes, wondering if they were going to make it.
Yeah.
It was a rough time, really.
Yeah. So,
really.
So where were you during that whole? Because
Well, I was 20.
Yeah.
No, I was deep in it because I was probably 10 years into doing real estate transactions at the time. So we saw the whole rise up. You know, the most amount of loan applications were in 2003. So 2003, 4, 5, you saw a spike in valuations and a lot of people were buying.
well, what does that mean, valuations?
Property valuation. So you saw an appreciation in the price of a home.
So the home started.
So for example, if someone bought a condominium in Charlestown
Yep.
in 1999
Yep.
for $170,000, by 2003, it was worth $280,000.
But why? Why does that happen?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of factors involved. There was low interest rates. There was a drive for home ownership. There was a lot of loosened regulations. 2003 and 4 weren't really when the real loose regulations happened, where what Kathleen Day is going to talk about is when Wall Street really got involved and started buying up so much mortgage product and reselling it in chunks through bonds and other securitized obligations that they could put out to the general public. Then it got really bad because they didn't have enough. There wasn't enough product, so they kept pushing, let's get more product out there. So they loosened the application process for borrowers. So people that should not have been able to buy a home were buying a home, and some were buying multiple homes. I mean, you can see one movie that actually does a really good job, one movie that does a really good job with it is The Big Short. If you were to ever see that movie, that explains it as well as any that I've seen to date. But we were in there watching all of these transactions we saw the subprime market come into play. So that's the Wall Street piece that we were talking about, where there was a lot of folks. They were just taking on so much of these debt obligations that it was really bad. There were people that were buying homes that were straws. They were folks that had multiple properties. People were buying properties for other people, which is the straw. There was a ton of fraud, but there was a group of people who were turning a blind eye to it because there was no ramifications to it.
Mm.
They were actually delivering loans that were within the guidelines of the buyer. So the buyer of those loans, ultimately Wall Street, was saying, yeah, I don't care. Don't verify income. Don't verify credit. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Just give me more loans. And these became these subprime loans.
That's really interesting. But isn't it the American dream that people should be given every opportunity to own a home? I mean, you know, we think about the IM, right? I mean, the home domain is so important, but to actually have your own home.
So are you referring to me saying people who should not have bought a home?
No, not at all. I'm saying that there, you know, there is, I hope, a momentum for people to be able to have that ownership. And we know that people who own their own homes are actually more invested in them as opposed to people who are, you know, renting from somebody else,
right?
Which makes sense, right? I mean, if it's your property, you're going to be invested in it. But there's so much.
Some people don't have the financial capacity or wherewithal to own a home, though,
right?
And make those monthly obligations,
right?
And I mean, people were buying homes, first of all, that were not United States citizens. Not that was the problem,
but they weren't living in the home.
They weren't living in the home.
Right,
some of it was just purely fake. I mean, there was fake people buying homes, but there was also people who were otherwise getting subsidies for rent that were turning around and buying homes. It was off the charts. We didn't handle any of those closings because we could smell that there was something very, very wrong. But there were attorneys that said, you know, greed is good. I'll do any closing that comes our way. And we stuck with the vanilla ones, but so the appreciation, the values continue to climb because it's a supply and demand balancing act, right?
Right.
You know, there were so many people demanding these home products that with not enough supply, so therefore the price adjusts accordingly, and it inflated all of the values artificially.
The supply went down because people could qualify to get a mortgage to buy a home, even if
there was so much demand. It's not that the supply went down; it's that the demand was so high that, you know, there's only so much housing product, and there was a lot of building and all of that. But, you know, at a certain point, the Ponzi ends. And it did. Yep. And it came crashing down. Really, it didn't come down super fast. It did to a lot of people, the general public. It was fast. The subprime mortgages started to fall apart in 2006, early 2007, and you could see that something was bad, but you just never realized that residential real estate in the United States of America had such a global impact.
Yeah.
And it did. It affected the entire world.
You were saying that you anticipated some of this.
Yeah, we did. So as the mortgages were starting to blow up, if you will, for lack of a better term, and values were starting to slide, we saw that people were struggling. And the only way out of this problem was through a concept called short selling. And we went out and we explained this to all the real estate agents that, you know, if you want to stay in business, there's going to be virtually no transactions for the next 2 years except for these types of distressed transactions, because no one's going to sell in a declining market. Nobody's going to want to sell their property.
And can you just sort of explain to our listening audience what a short sale is?
Yeah. So in essence, what a short sale transaction is you say to the bank, I owe you more than my property's worth. Therefore, in order for me to sell the property, I have to give you less short, right? Less than what I owe you. So I'm going to sell it short of what all of the debt obligation is.
And
will you pretty please accept that and let me sell with dignity?
So the bank was also going to lose money because they had lent somebody got, let's say $320,000, right? Somebody sold that house for $320,000. That person got the money.
Correct.
But now that house is only worth, what do you say, maybe $280,000.
Right.
So that's $40,000
Yeah.
less, if my math is correct.
That's good math.
Thank you. It's quick. So something adds up every now and then. So the bank then, they're going to lose $40,000.
Well, and the whole conversation was because we ended up, in essence, we were negotiating, right? We were negotiating for their borrower, the seller of the home, and saying to the bank, hey, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Countrywide at the time was a lot of the loans that we were talking to. Here's the deal. Yeah, you're owed $320. We understand that, and frankly, we're sorry. The property right now is worth $280, and it's going to cost you, because what's happened is that the homeowner, their borrower, their customer has said, I'm not going to pay this anymore. This doesn't even make sense. I'm $40,000 underwater. It may never come back, which was the thought.
And they're paying a
that
mortgage.
That was their IM at the time, right?
That was their IM at the time. That's right.
Is it ever going to come back, right? Is it ever going to come back?
That's right.
So their thought process was, I'm $40,000 underwater. I'm out. I'm just going to put the keys on the table. You can take it. Do whatever you want.
But aren't there legal ramifications for that if you walk away from your mortgage?
So that's where the short sale kind of negotiation came in, and it went like this. Hey, bank, you're going to lose a lot more than $40,000. We can, get it to a point where you're only losing $40,000, maybe $50,000 after costs and everything, as opposed to you having to go to foreclose, go through that whole process, the time, the expense. You're still losing money on that loan because you're not earning the interest on it. And now, you've got an upset customer who's not going to willingly move out. So you're going to have to go through that whole eviction. Hopefully you did the foreclosure correctly. Now we're into, a year of time. The value's probably going down more because we're in a declining market.
Right.
It's 08, 09's coming.
Right. So a couple of questions. So first of all, did the banks, and maybe this is more a question for our guest, but did the banks put themselves in this situation by giving out these mortgages?
Yes.
Okay. The second thing is, how many mortgages are we talking about? 40,000 is one thing, but are we talking about,
there was a lot. There was probably. There was hundreds of thousands.
And 40,000 is a conservative number, is my guess.
$40,000?
Yeah.
Oh, there were short sales by the time 2010, 11 rolled around. There was short sales of hundreds of thousands of dollars that were left.
So this now puts the bank in crisis. Am I missing something? Because now the bank is losing tens of millions, hundreds of millions.
Well, don't forget, they now even they have to hire departments to handle losing money, right? So when we first started doing this in 2007, and the banks didn't even really understand what we were saying to them, and we were educating them on this is your only way out of this problem. They didn't have staff to handle it, so they had to create these new these loss mitigation departments is what they were called. And now, every bank has them now, but they're hiring people to help mitigate the loss, right? So they're hiring people to help them lose money. So multiply that over and over and over again, and J.P. Morgan Chase was in trouble. Wells Fargo was in trouble.
Right. And
Bank of America had Countrywide shoved down their throat by the feds. The feds were scrambling. It was how do we make sure that we don't go into a depression? I'm looking forward to hearing her researched thoughts on this. But it was, and I was paying very close attention to it. So I was play by play watching it and watching the boots on the ground. Watching those people come in who worked really hard, were honest folks, but they had no alternative but to sell their house short and go rent for 4 or 5 years until your credit recovers, and then you can go buy again. And the sad part about it is that those people kind of I would sit down with them and say, here's really what Fannie Mae's guidelines are. It's going to be, at the time, maybe 3 years from a short sale, because what the short sale does is it affects your credit in a way that it says, sold for less than, or closed, because it's just the debt itself. Your credit report reported something along the lines of closed for less than full amount or something like that. So everyone knew who was looking at it. The underwriters who, if you went in to try to get another loan, they'd say, okay, this was a short sale, and you have 3 years or 4 years, I forget what it was at the time, to cleanse that.
So that's a cascade effect right there.
Yeah.
So I just want to, back up for a moment and look at the IM on this.
Yeah.
So we've spent a lot of time over the last several months talking about the IM, right? The idea that you're doing the best you can at this moment in time with the potential to change. But we've been talking about it at an individual level. We've been talking about a person's IM. But the IM is also can be applied to systems and to entire societies and to entire, economic structures. And that's part of what we're looking at. So,
but there was individual IMs going on too.
Absolutely.
We instituted tissues in our conference rooms because of this.
Right. No question. And we may spend a moment or two looking at the biological domain of a person who's going through a home foreclosure. Their home is undervalued, being taken away. The social domain, all the banks and all the federal governments and everything is like coming down on them. The IC domain, they feel like they're a loser and they are less than. And biologically, we know. I mean, we have lots of literature to support this. The suicide rate increased as part of that housing.
I'm sure.
Crash because people felt they were so depressed and so displaced, and where are they going to go? So we have the data to support that. It's horrible. But from a systems point of view, let's just take a look. Okay, so here we are. The United States has an IM. This is our home domain, right? So the home of the United States. The social domain is our interaction with the rest of the world. And it seems like the fact that there was all this financial turmoil going on in our home domain of the United States, how did that affect the way the rest of the world saw us in terms of a place to invest, right? Which is the IC domain.
Well, it's also the security of the U.S., right? So everybody's looking to us, and you guys are falling apart. Now
That's
what?
right. Exactly.
What do we do?
So you see
Very
what I'm saying?
similar to the family looking up at the parents saying, oh, my goodness,
so do you
where are we going to go?
Do you see how the IM approach can be applied outside of the individual at this macro level? Home domain, the United States, the housing market is falling apart. Social domain, it's affecting the rest of the world.
For those just tuning in, we're still talking about 2008. It's not now.
Right. Sorry, guys. Yeah, thank you, Mark. The IC domain, the way the rest of the world starts seeing us as a country and as a place to invest and as a place where they can look to for safety and security.
Yep.
And then the biological domain, which are all of our people, all of whom are going through this crisis. So, I want people to start recognizing that the IM is applicable on these very different levels. And today we're talking about, the IM of banking and the IM of housing and the IM of market crash. This approach is a way for us to step back and analyze and look at why things happen, why we do what we do, without judging it. Because if we judge it, we're going to start picking sides. We're going to start saying, this one was bad, that one was bad, as opposed to really looking at, well, so what happens when you take away regulations?
Yeah.
What happens when you're trying really hard to make something good happen, but you're not always really using your prefrontal cortex and thinking about the future and what potentially can happen? What happens when there's greed involved? It's still an IM, and this is the hard part to really come to terms with the IM. It doesn't mean you're going to win, but let's look again at why we're doing it. Let's again look. Let's respect why this happened, because if you can't do that, don't you think you're at risk of it just happening again and again and again?
That's history, right? It tends to do it.
And I think that's part of what our guest is going to be talking about. Kathleen Day coming in right next, talking about broken bargain and this history that we have in the United States of sometimes the markets just crashing.
Well, it tends to happen in cycles too, and it's strange how it happens because I went to a conference this week that was for the mortgage servicers, right? And it was because I started to feel something was missing in our real estate market. We were starting to see in our office more distressed type sellers. It seemed like there was more bank-owned properties as part of the transactions that we were doing, which we hadn't seen in 4 or 5 years. So I looked down and I said, "Oh my goodness, it's been 10 years." That's the natural cycle. So I specifically went down there to kind of get my thumb on the pulse of what the mortgage services were thinking, and at the same time to try to figure out how to reach some of those potential clients so that when those bank-owned properties are owned by the banks, they're going to need to sell them. They're going to need an attorney. So I was down there, trying to solicit business. But
that's smart, Mark.
But what? Thank you.
It's a good IM.
Yes, thank you. But what they were saying is, it's interesting because the folks that are making those decisions now are young enough to not, and it's only 10 years, but they're young enough not to have experienced it. So if they're 28 years old, they were in high school and they weren't really paying attention. If they were on an academic level, they weren't feeling it.
No.
Right? Which I think is a much different experience to actually feel a market collapse.
Yeah.
Than, because most of those kids, I'll call them, who are now making some of the decisions for, underwriting and such, their parents probably sheltered them from it to a certain degree. I mean, I would have if my kids were in high school at the time. I mean, I was in high school during the savings and loan crisis, which was the crisis 10 years prior to the mortgage meltdown.
I cannot be more excited than to introduce our guest. Professor Day, are you on the phone now?
I am on the phone, and I hope you can hear me well.
Oh, we can hear you wonderfully. Wonderfully. And I want you to introduce you, Mark Stiles, my co-host, is here.
Hello, Professor Day.
Hello. Hey, how are you? You don't need to call me Professor Day. I have 2 graduate degrees. I do have an MBA, but I don't have a PhD. And but you can call me Professor. If you can be a doctor, I can be a professor.
Right.
There we go. Well, I'm Dr. Joe, and I do have an MD. But
MD. No, I know you do. I looked at your.
Thanks.
But I am a teacher. I am a professor at Johns Hopkins. So. You can do that.
That's great. We will. And we would just want to let people know who we're talking with.
Well,
Mark?
Professor Kathleen Day spent 30 years as a business journalist with the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and USA Today before joining the Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business as a professor of finance in 2013. She writes for the Washington Post, USA Today, and Aussie.com, and has appeared on the Diane Rem Show, CNBC, Fox News, and she lives in Washington, D.C.
So welcome. Thank you so much. Let's get right to it. You've written this amazing book, Broken Bargains. How did you even begin deciding you were going to write this?
Well, I was creating a course that basically was me downloading my reporter's notebook of having covered Wall Street for 30 years, 2.5 decades, basically at the Washington Post. So I was covering, I was telling students about the history of financial crises, and there's so many great business books written about every crisis that there is, but that's too much. That's just too much for any one person to read, certainly in one course. So I wrote the book that I needed that one could read in one place in plain English, a history of finance and banking in the United States. It started out, just doing the crises of the last 100 years, and I realized I really had to go back a little further, and I ended up going back to the drafting of the Constitution. So it's a history of banking and finance.
Wow. And right there at the drafting of the Constitution, we only have, unfortunately, about a little less than half an hour, but what was going on back then that really is the thread that's applicable even today?
Well, everyone knows now, especially with the musical Hamilton, that Hamilton and Jefferson were fighting over whether the U.S. government, whether the United States as a country should have a central bank. And what I learned in doing this book is that central to that question was whether the federal government could create corporations, because only governments can create corporations. And when you create a corporation, you create a legal entity that shields your shareholders from unlimited liability. So their argument with each other was whether the federal government could do that. And this, to me, is so interesting. The words bank and corporation don't appear in the Constitution because they were taken out, because people felt they were too divisive. People argued about them so much that they feared it wouldn't be ratified.
Wow.
So, and that's the contract. That's the beginning of the bargain, because only a government can give you the gift of being incorporated and gives that gift on behalf of the public. It has a duty to go in and make sure that there's nothing that is going on in that corporation that is bad for the public. Now, Jefferson thought it was just too dangerous to even try it. Hamilton understood many of the fears Jefferson had. He understood you had to ride herd on these entities, but he just thought you needed them to have a robust economy, which is in fact correct. So the bargain is somebody's supposed to be watching the store and making sure that it's being operated in a good way. And we sometimes forget that because we let business tell us, oh, it's too much red tape, get away, go. You know, if you're going to be incorporated, you have to agree to let the people that give you that gift look at you and see what you're doing.
And when that doesn't happen, because it seems like that has been a pattern, that regulations somehow are forgiven, what happens then when there isn't that oversight?
Then you get crazy times. You get banks or other lending institutions engaging in practices that turn out to be really bad, oftentimes for taxpayers, is one of the themes in the book. Now, this bargain got, if you fast forward 140 years, I hope I have the math right, to the 30s, when in the wake of the 1929 crash and the Great Depression, we decided as a policy in this country to have federal deposit insurance. That is another aspect of the bargain, because now you are explicitly saying, we are going to give you, you're not only incorporated, but we're going to give you this safety net that taxpayers are behind. And in exchange for that, believe it or not, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was against deposit insurance, and Hoover, the Republicans, were for it. And FDR was afraid it would be misused and end up in the taxpayer's lap, which it in fact has. And the only way to prevent that is to have regulators be vigilant in overseeing these institutions. So, you know, they when things are going great, it's like the regulators are saying now, everything's great, we can kind of loosen up on stuff. And they're doing stuff now to really weaken consumer safeguards. You don't want lots of regulation and red tape. Of course not. No one does. But only the government can come in and say, here's a level playing field, folks. Here's things that are out of bounds. Simple things, like only the government can say to lenders, before you make a loan, you need, I know this sounds ridiculous, but you need to make sure the person can afford it. You may say, well, of course you would do that. But in fact, one of the root causes of the big crisis 10 years ago was that lenders were making home loans without assessing whether people could afford them, believe it or not.
But how do we get to that? How do we get to that sort of laxity?
Well, one of the things that happened, free marketers would think you would never get there because no lender would ever do something that was against their own interest. And of course, you would think the logical extension of that, well, they wouldn't want to lend money to someone that wouldn't repay it. Why would they do that? Well, the reason is that the investment banks in the 80s went from being partnerships where basically the shareholders and the executives are one and the same, so they are very cautious about taking risks because their money is involved. And they became publicly traded. They became incorporated. And they, in doing that, you start to have executives who are not the shareholders. So the owners and the executives are separated, and the executives are interested in more short-term horizons to meet their earnings targets so they can trigger their compensation, their bonuses. They have a short-term outlook. And on Wall Street, there's even a name for it. I always have to write it down or I won't do it. IBG, and that stands for I'll be gone, you'll be gone. So don't worry about it. This isn't a good deal. As long as it looks good, we'll meet our targets, and by the time it crashes, we'll be gone.
Wow.
So that's one of the ingredients. I know. It's a perverse incentive.
Well, you mentioned the free market and no one's going to lend to somebody who doesn't believe that they'd get paid back unless they can offload that loan immediately, right? And that's kind of what was happening.
Yeah. Right, but there's a way to do that. That's I don't want to use. I do want to speak about this in English, but it's securitization. If you can sell that loan to someone else who's going to do other things with it, that can be done in a responsibly, in a way that really does mitigate, lessen, not eliminate, but lessen risk. But if you do it irresponsibly, instead of lessening risk, it's not just that it doesn't work, it actually amplifies it.
Right.
So you are spreading this bad stuff through the system. And what could have saved everything is if the regulators, particularly at the Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan, had peered into what was going on and said, guys, this is really, it may feel good now to eat this much candy, but, you're giving yourself diabetes.
Right.
It's too much.
So before we go any further, how do people get the book?
You can order it anywhere, all the normal places. I like to promote independent bookstores, but of course you can go on Amazon. You can go to my website, and then there's places to click to. I don't get the money. There are buttons you can click. If you go to KathleenDay.com, you can. It'll take you to Barnes and Noble or my local bookstore in D.C., Politics and Prose, or Amazon. So any of those places, you can get it. And one thing I just want to mention is, even though I did write it for my course that I have created on a history of financial crises, it is intended to be for general readers, so that rank and file people, anyone could pick it up who really wants to understand how all this happened, particularly starting with the Constitution, but in particular the last 100 years. And in particular, within that, the last 20, they could really read this book and understand what happened in these crises.
And I completely corroborate that, because I have been reading it. It is so well written. It's a page turner.
Thank
you. It's
you.
engaging, and it does make you go, whoa. So what about now? How is this playing out right now?
Well, because we are 10 years down the road, people are beginning to get amnesia and forget what happened. And so some of the safeguards that were put in place are being dismantled. And one of the things some of the regulators now are saying to lenders, you don't always have to assess a person's ability to repay. And so that's going from traditional underwriting to what we call asset-based underwriting. So they'll make you a loan if whatever you're purchasing with it, they think they can confiscate if you default. That's just a very risky way of doing things, and that's what happened in the mortgage crisis. Another thing is that one federal regulator has proposed allowing non-banks, which is a term I hope I would never hear again because it was there in the 80s, a non-bank, a lender who doesn't take deposits is all that is. They're thinking of giving companies like that federal charters. And that sounds interesting, but what they're really doing is they're trying to give these companies a way to thumb their nose at state law. And it's the states who historically, there are some federal consumer protection laws, but most are at the state level. And it's the states who sounded the early warning system in the last crisis, and they were basically told by the federal government, federal regulators, to shut up and sit down.
Wow.
And so once again, they're doing that to the state regulators, or they're trying to. And that's what this charter this federal charter for non-banks would do. It's a bad idea.
And where is this idea coming from?
This is another mouthful. The comptroller of the currency, the federal regulator who charters and regulates national banks. And it's a unit inside Treasury, and it was created right before the Civil War. And again, this is one of the things that I learned when writing this book. Maybe you guys knew it, but I didn't. I didn't know that before the Civil War we didn't have a national currency, and so each state chartered banks issued currency for the country. So there were like 7,000 to 9,000 different pieces of paper. You'd have to change you'd have to convert your currency going from one state to another the way you used to have to do in Europe before the euro. It was crazy. Anyway, so Lincoln, for the Civil War, realized we needed a national currency. War, by the way, often figures in to what happens in banking and finance. And so he and his Treasury Secretary came up with this plan to have nationally chartered banks, and that's how we began to get we've had a national currency ever since. So that's what this regulator is there. Now, when the Fed took over the function of money, the comptroller no longer did that, but they still charter and regulate national banks. And so it is this office that is proposing this federal charter. And you're always going to hear when these things happen that it's in the name of innovation and increasing people's access to credit. And what that always means is typically these things really are not innovative. They're ways to get around regulations, and they often, when they say expand credit, is too easy credit. It makes it too easy to get it, and it like giving someone a loan without assessing whether they can afford it. It just doesn't make sense.
So, Kathleen, what are you trying to help us with here, in terms of you might have heard about the I am approach, where the idea is we're always doing the best we can. Small changes have big effects, but we control no one, we influence everyone. What kind of influence are you hoping your book will have for the general reader?
I'm hoping people realize that they should care about these subjects. We've been arguing about them for 250 years, and I'm hoping people can understand they're more accessible than you think. And if they are a more informed person about these issues, they'll pay more attention as voters, because that's really the only way to counter the lobbying influence of Wall Street, which is often pushing for changes that in the long run aren't even good for itself, as they periodically realize. I mean, at the end of the last crisis, and this is a scene I paint in the book, a head guy at Citibank was pleading with the Treasury Secretary of the United States, can't you save us from ourselves? So there's this recognition that even from people who claim they don't want any government oversight, that only the government can come in and say, hey, guys, no one should do these types of things. Otherwise, everyone's going to be tempted to, and when one person does it, everyone does it. So I'm hoping this book makes readers understand they can understand these things. They can understand the dollars and cents of these things, and it's common sense. It's really not by party ideology. It's just some good old Yankee common sense can be applied to try to prevent this. And these are not normal credit cycles, by the way. These are outsized crises that can be avoided. Credit cycles, the economy goes down some, it goes up some. That is not what I'm talking about in this book. I'm talking about these disruptions that the banking crisis of the 80s, the most recent one, those and the crash of 29, the Great Depression, is to weave these together and let people understand how we have evolved in banking and oversight, so they can understand it and maybe then influence somebody. So
I can't help myself. So the common sense of dollar and cents?
Well, yes, it is. It really is. And by the way, common sense, Tame, he's in the book too. I do think there are some common sense things that happen in finance that don't change. People always try to dress everything up they want to do as innovation and expanding credit, when in fact a lot of people who really need more credit aren't getting it. Small dollar loans that are not abusive, those things are not being introduced. So people need to watch out for those buzzwords of innovation. Mm-hmm. A lot of times when you hear that word, you should grab your wallet, make sure no one's trying to take that out of your back pocket. So I'm hoping it makes people more. Pardon?
Ease of credit, is that another one they want to run from?
Yes. What I term in the book is easy credit is too much borrowed money is available for too few good investments. Right. These are my definitions. But I just think you can break this stuff down into plain English. Like if I said to you, do you know what a synthetic collateralized debt obligation is? Your eyes will glaze over. Yep. And, do you understand fantasy baseball?
To understand what?
Do you understand fantasy baseball or fantasy football teams?
Yeah.
When people, if you understand that, you understand what a synthetic collateralized debt. It is. I really try to break it down like that. And when I tell audiences, do you know what fantasy baseball teams are? They all say, "Oh yeah," and I'll say, "Well, it's just an index, isn't it?" And they'll all say, "Oh yeah, that is what it is." Huh. Common sense. People understand more of this than they realize because I don't care how complicated you try to make it. And you may have so much of it that you have to have a computer to keep track of it or whatever, or even to value some of it. But the basic workings of it, most people can understand. They just can.
Do you think people don't want to understand it, though? They just kind of block it out and trust the process?
Yes, but I also think they think, oh, I'm not smart enough. Yeah. These guys are such wizards. And they're really not. And, I mean, even the guys who really were the brainiacs at the hedge fund that nearly brought down the economy, chock full of people from Harvard and MIT and Nobel Prize winners, and their arrogance did them, and they nearly brought down the whole economy. So, you don't have to be, the regular people can understand this. And I think there's an appetite. People really do want to understand it, I think.
And just to back up to something that you said a little earlier about, how small changes can have big effects, it is absolutely right that people have the right to vote. And you can vote for people who you believe are going to lead us down a much more a path of much greater economic stability. But how do we as the common person, how do we actually do this? Does my opening a bank account or my getting a mortgage or getting a second mortgage, does that have an effect on this cascade of crisis? So, I mean...
Sure, depending upon what terms you get it on. Absolutely, it could.
And so that's part of something. What I don't mean to throw banks under the bus, but what I've noticed is that when I get to a certain part of my mortgage, they want me to refinance. Right? So
they love that because they want the fees. Every time you refinance, they get a bunch of fees. They love that.
Yeah.
So yes. But too often our conversation is with people who are vilifying Wall Street and on the other side that are just carrying their water. And neither is right. We need finance. Finance is the glue or the oil that keeps the machinery going. Hamilton was quite right about that. But we also need oversight. Jefferson was quite right that, he's famous for saying that banks are more dangerous than standing armies. But I don't know if that's true, but it is. But they nearly did bring down our economy. That's a national security risk. I think we need them. We need finance, and it's a good thing when used properly. So I think it just goes to extremes. Right. Oftentimes. And so what I really wish is it would be campaign finance reform so that people on elected officials, especially in Congress, who need to regulate the regulators, were speaking only about ideas and not about who's funding their next campaign.
Yeah.
That's what I wish.
Well,
I think we could have intelligent conversations.
Yeah, I wish we had more time for this because I think we have just begun to open up the treasure chest that we're talking about of all the information. encourage folks, get this book, Broken Bargain with Kathleen Day. It is absolutely a great read. I'm serious.
It's fascinating.
It's fascinating. It's a page turner. You just are drawn into who we are in our history of finance. And so I just want to thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Thank you.
We wish you the best with this. I can't wait to hear the next book, and I'm really hoping that using this we can avoid our next financial crisis. So let's do it.
Well, don't hold your breath, but thank you so very much.
Thanks so
you.
much, Kathleen. And to all our listeners, we'll see you all next week. Benepotent, thanks a lot. Tom and Mark.
Thank you, Dr. Joe.
Good night, all.
Bye.
Wild.